Did you enjoy the lake house I bought you, Mom? My son asked with a proud smile, as if he had just handed me the world, and for a moment I thought I had misheard him, because I stood there in my small kitchen, the one-bedroom apartment I had been renting for the past 2 years, the kind with peeling paint near the window and a heater that rattled every winter night, and I felt something cold settle in my chest as I replied, "What house?" The room went quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, not like the comfortable silence of a family meal, but the kind that stretches too long, like everyone is waiting for someone else to fix a mistake that has already been made. It was Thanksgiving, and I had spent all morning preparing dinner, waking up before sunrise to thaw the turkey, measuring every ingredient carefully so nothing would go to waste, because even a few extra dollars mattered to me now, though I never let David see that part of my life, not fully. At 68, I had learned how to make things look easier than they were. I smoothed over the cracks, the same way I had done my entire life, raising my son, supporting my husband, keeping a home together even when things were falling apart behind the scenes. David was standing across from me, tall, confident, wearing a tailored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and for a second, I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who would run into my arms after school, asking if I had made his favorite dinner. But that image slipped away quickly, replaced by the man he had become, successful, distant, someone who spoke in numbers and deals and investments I didn't fully understand. "The lake house," he said again, slower this time, like he was trying to help me remember something obvious, and that was when I noticed her.
Victoria.
She had been standing just behind him, quiet until now, but not invisible. Her posture was too still, her smile just a fraction too tight, and when David repeated the question, her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the kitchen counter, as if she needed something to hold on to. I hadn't noticed it before, but now that I was really looking, it was all I could see. "David," I said carefully, setting the serving spoon down so my hands wouldn't shake, "I never received a house." The words felt heavier than they should have, like they carried something underneath them that I couldn't yet name. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face, genuine and unguarded, and then it shifted into something else, something sharper, more calculating. Behind him, Victoria took a small step forward, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, and though she didn't say anything, the air in the room changed. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. I could feel it now, deep in my bones, the way you sense a storm before you hear the thunder. I had spent the last 2 years believing I was simply struggling, that life had tightened around me after my husband passed, that it was normal to cut back, to make do, to survive quietly. But standing there, looking at my son and the woman beside him, I realized something that hadn't even crossed my mind before. I wasn't just struggling. Something had been taken from me, and whoever had taken it was standing in my kitchen. I did not say anything else after that, not right away, because I needed a moment to steady myself, to understand what I was hearing without letting my face give anything away, and in that silence, I became aware of the small details I had ignored for far too long, the kind that only makes sense when you stop assuming everything is fine. The kitchen smelled like roasted turkey and sage stuffing, warm and familiar, but the feeling inside me was anything but. For the past 2 years, I had been living in a place that barely felt like home, a narrow apartment on the second floor of a quiet building where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors cough at night, and every month I would sit at the same small table by the window, carefully sorting through my bills, deciding what could wait and what could not. There were weeks when I stretched a single grocery trip longer than it should have lasted, learning how to turn simple ingredients into something that felt like a proper meal, telling myself that this was just a temporary phase, that I did not want to burden my son with my struggles when he already had so much on his plate. I remembered the winter when the heating bill came in higher than expected, and I spent most evenings wrapped in an extra blanket instead of turning up the thermostat, telling myself it was good for me, that I did not need much to be comfortable. I remembered standing at the pharmacy counter, quietly asking the clerk if there was a more affordable option for my medication, smiling as if it was no big deal when she explained the difference in price. At the time, I believed this was simply what life had become, a quieter, smaller version of what I once had, and I accepted it with the same quiet resilience I had always relied on. But now, standing in my own kitchen with my son looking at me in confusion, and my daughter-in-law standing just behind him, too still, too careful. Those memories shifted into something else entirely. They were no longer signs of a modest life. They were evidence. Evidence that something had not reached me when it was meant to. "Mom, that is not possible," David said finally, his voice firm but uncertain as he reached for his phone, already scrolling through something I could not see, his movements quick, precise, the way he handled problems in his business world. I had everything arranged. The deed, the transfers, even the monthly support payments. "You should have been receiving $1,500 every month."
$1,500.
The number echoed in my mind in a way that made the room feel smaller, like the walls were inching closer. $1,500 would have changed everything. It would have meant I did not have to count every dollar at the grocery store, that I could keep the heat on without hesitation, that I could replace the worn coat I had been wearing for 2 winters in a row. I did not interrupt him, did not rush to defend myself or demand answers, because something deeper told me that this moment was not about reacting. It was about watching, understanding. "David," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady, "I have never received any payments." The words settled between us, heavier than before, and this time, when I looked at Victoria, she could not quite meet my eyes. I watched her carefully then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the kind of quiet attention that comes from finally understanding that something has been wrong for a long time, because when a person cannot meet your eyes in a moment like that, it tells you more than any explanation ever could. Victoria adjusted her bracelet, a small movement, almost meaningless on its own, but her hands were not steady, and she kept glancing toward David, as if measuring how much he had already figured out. It was subtle, the kind of thing I might have missed before, back when I trusted every smile, every polite word, every carefully chosen gesture that made her seem thoughtful and composed. But now those same details felt rehearsed, like pieces of a performance I had unknowingly been watching for years. David was still scrolling through his phone, his brow tightening as he read through whatever records he had pulled up, and I could see the shift happening in him, slow but undeniable, the way certainty begins to crack when it meets something it cannot explain. "There are confirmations here," he said, almost to himself, his voice quieter now, more focused. "Bank transfers, scheduled payments, everything was processed on time." He looked up at me then, searching my face, as if hoping I would suddenly remember, as if this could still be a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a simple explanation.
But I did not give him that.
I could not. "I have never seen any of that money," I said, just as calmly as before, because raising my voice would not make the truth any clearer, and something inside me told me that staying composed was the only way to truly see what was unfolding. The room felt different now, heavier, like the warmth of the holiday had been replaced by something colder, something sharper. Victoria let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but it did not sound natural. "Maybe there was a mistake," she said, her tone light but strained, stepping a little closer, as if proximity alone could soften the tension. "You know how these things can get mixed up, especially with paperwork and mailing addresses." I turned my head slightly and looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I did not see my daughter-in-law. I saw a woman calculating her next sentence before she spoke it, weighing her words carefully, choosing them not for truth, but for effect. "There is no mistake," David said before I could respond, his voice firmer now, and when he turned toward her, the distance between them was not physical, but it was unmistakable. The account information was verified. The transfers were completed. If Mom did not receive anything, then it went somewhere else. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, of pieces coming together in a way that could not be undone. Victoria's smile faltered then, just for a second, and in that second, everything became clear to me, not through a confession, not through proof, but through the absence of denial that should have come easily, if she had nothing to hide. I did not interrupt them. I did not rush to conclusions out loud. I simply stood there, taking it all in, feeling something shift deep inside me, something that had been quiet for a long time now beginning to wake up. Because this was no longer about confusion or missing paperwork. This was about trust that had been misplaced, and a truth that was finally beginning to show itself, one small crack at a time. I could feel it settling into place now, not as a sudden realization, but as something that had been building quietly for years, layer by layer, moment by moment, and only now did I have the clarity to see it for what it was. There had been signs, of course, small ones, easy to dismiss at the time, wrapped in polite explanations and reasonable excuses. I remember the first year after my husband passed, when David had insisted on handling certain financial matters for me, saying it would be easier, that I should not have to worry about paperwork or accounts during such a difficult time. I had trusted him without question. Why would I not? He was my son, the boy I had raised, the man I believed would always look out for me. And Victoria had been right there beside him, offering to help organize documents, suggesting they could streamline everything so I would not feel overwhelmed. At the time, it had felt like care, like support, like family stepping in when it mattered most. But now, standing in that same kitchen, those memories shifted into something else entirely. I remembered how certain letters had stopped arriving, how statements that used to come regularly were suddenly being handled online, how Victoria would casually mention that everything was taken care of whenever I asked, her tone always reassuring, always just enough to keep me from pressing further. I had told myself that the world was changing, that everything was digital now, that it was normal for things to feel different. I had not wanted to seem difficult, or suspicious, or ungrateful. So I let it go. Again and again I let it go. David's voice pulled me back to the present. I need to see the account details, he said, more to himself than to either of us, but there's an urgency there now, something sharper than before. He was no longer trying to solve a small confusion. He was trying to understand something that should not exist. Victoria shifted her weight, her composure thinning in ways she could not quite hide anymore. David, this is not the time, she said softly, placing a hand on his arm, her voice gentle but insistent. It is Thanksgiving. We can sort this out later. Later. The word lingered in the air, and for the first time, I understood how many things had been pushed into that space, how many questions had been delayed, how many answers had been quietly avoided. David did not move his arm away immediately, but he did not relax into her touch either. No, he said after a moment, his tone steady, grounded in something deeper than before. If something is wrong, I want to understand it now. I watched the two of them, not as a mother watching her son and daughter-in-law, but as someone seeing a truth unfold in real time, without illusion. Victoria's hand slipped back to her side, her fingers curling slightly, as if she needed to hold onto something again. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then paused, her eyes flicking toward me for just a fraction of a second before returning to David. It was not fear exactly, not yet, but it was not confidence either.
And that was enough.
I did not need raised voices or dramatic confessions. I did not need accusations or denials. The absence of certainty in her expression, the careful way she chose when to speak and when to remain silent, told me everything I needed to know. I had spent years believing I was being supported, protected, guided through a world that had grown more complicated with time. But the truth was simpler than that, and far more painful. I had not been guided. I had been redirected. And now, for the first time, the path they had set for me was beginning to unravel right in front of all of us. I stepped back slightly, not enough for anyone to notice, but just enough to give myself space to think clearly, because I understood something now that I had not fully grasped before, that reacting too quickly would only blur the picture that was finally coming into focus. David had moved toward the dining table, his phone still in his hand, his attention fixed on the information in front of him, as if the answers were hidden somewhere between the lines of numbers and confirmations. I could see the tension building in him, not loud or explosive, but controlled, the kind that tightens your jaw and sharpens your gaze. Victoria remained where she was, but her stillness had changed. It was no longer composed. It was careful. There is a difference, one that only becomes visible when you stop trusting what you are being shown. Let me see the transfer details, David said, his voice steady but no longer warm, and he extended his hand slightly toward her, not demanding, but expecting. It was a simple request, One that should have been easy to fulfill if everything had been as it was supposed to be. For a brief moment, Victoria did not move. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a pause that lasted just long enough to matter. Then she smiled, the same polished smile I had seen countless times before, and reached for her phone. "Of course," she said lightly, as if nothing in the room had shifted, as if this was just another detail to confirm. But her fingers hesitated over the screen, and I noticed the way she angled the phone slightly away, as if she needed to control what could be seen and what could not. I had seen that gesture before, though I had not understood it at the time. It was the same way she would hold documents when discussing finances, offering just enough visibility to reassure, but never enough to invite questions. David took a step closer, his patience thinning in a quiet, controlled way. "Victoria," he said, and this time there was no softness left in his tone, only focus. "Show me." She exhaled slowly, as if steadying herself, and then turned the screen toward him. I could not see what was displayed, but I did not need to. I watched David instead. His eyes moved quickly, scanning, processing, and then something changed. It was subtle at first, a tightening around his eyes, a slight shift in his posture, but then his shoulders straightened, and the air around him seemed to grow still. "These accounts," he said slowly, each word measured. "This is not my mother's account." Victoria opened her mouth, ready with an answer, but for the first time, she did not speak immediately. That silence, that hesitation, was louder than anything she could have said. "It is a joint account," she replied finally, her voice carefully even, as if she had rehearsed this explanation before. "We used it to manage things more efficiently. It was easier this way." Easier. The word settled into the room like something heavy. I felt a quiet clarity rise within me, not anger, not yet, but something steadier, something colder. Easier for whom? I did not ask the question out loud. I did not need to. David was already looking at her in a way he had not before, not as his partner, not as someone he trusted without question, but as someone he was beginning to see for the first time without the filter he had always relied on. And as I stood there, watching the space between them widen in ways neither of them could close, I realized that whatever had been hidden for all this time was no longer protected by silence, and once something like that is exposed, it cannot be carefully placed back where it was. It begins to unravel, thread by thread, whether anyone is ready for it or not. The word lingered longer than anything else that had been said, not because it was loud, but because it was precise, and precision has a way of cutting through confusion without raising its voice. A joint account. I repeated it quietly in my mind, letting it settle, letting it connect itself to everything I had already begun to understand. David did not respond immediately, and that silence was different from before. It was not uncertainty. It was calculation. He looked down at the screen again, slower this time, reading not just what was there but what it implied, what it revealed when you stopped taking things at face value. "This account," he said finally, his voice even but firm, "has your name on it." He did not need to say more. The implication was already clear, hanging in the air between them like something that could not be ignored. Victoria straightened slightly, as if gathering herself, her posture returning to that familiar composure she had relied on for years. "Yes," she said, her tone controlled, measured. "I helped manage things. You were busy, David. You asked me to take care of details." There it was. Not denial. Not exactly. Just a careful reshaping of responsibility, shifting the edges of the truth until it almost looked reasonable. I had seen that before too, though I had not recognized it for what it was. David let out a slow breath, his eyes still on the screen, but his focus had changed. He was no longer searching for answers. He was confirming what he had already begun to suspect. "I asked you to coordinate," he said, his voice steady, but there was a distance in it now, a separation that had not been there before. "Not redirect funds." Victoria's expression tightened for just a moment, a flicker that passed quickly, but not quickly enough. "I did what made sense at the time," she replied, and this time there was a faint edge beneath the calm, something defensive, something that had not been there before. Everything was still being handled. Nothing was lost. Nothing was lost. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was so revealing. Loss is not always about disappearance. Sometimes it is about absence where something should have been. Sometimes it is about a life lived smaller than it needed to be, because what was meant for you never arrived. I stepped forward then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to place myself within the conversation in a way I had not done before. I lived for 2 years believing I had nothing, I said, my voice quiet, steady, and I watched as both of them turned toward me. That is not the same as nothing being lost. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. David looked at me and something in his expression shifted again. Not confusion, not even anger, but something deeper, something closer to realization. The kind that changes how you see everything that came before. Victoria did not respond right away. She held her composure, but it was thinner now, stretched in ways that could not hold forever. Margaret, she said carefully, choosing my name instead of anything softer. You never asked. You never wanted to be involved in these things. I held her gaze, calm, unwavering. Trust is not the same as disinterest, I replied. And for the first time since this conversation began, she had no immediate answer. The room felt still again, but this time it was not uncertain. It was settled, as if the truth had found its place, and was no longer waiting to be uncovered. And as I stood there, looking at the two of them, I realized that whatever came next would not be about discovering what had happened. That part was already done. What remained was what each of us would choose to do with it. David did not look away from me after I spoke, and that alone told me more than anything he could have said, because for the first time since he had walked into my home that day, he was no longer trying to reconcile two different realities. He was beginning to accept that one of them had never been true. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in restraint, the kind that comes when a person is choosing their next words carefully, knowing they will change everything that follows. How much? He asked quietly, still holding the phone in his hand, but now his attention was fully on Victoria. The question was simple, but it carried weight, not just about numbers, but about time, about trust, about every month that had passed without his knowledge. Victoria hesitated again, and this time the pause was longer, heavier, impossible to disguise. I would have to review the statements, she said, her voice controlled but thinner than before, as if each word required more effort to hold steady. David did not nod, did not accept the answer as sufficient. No, he said, his tone calm but firm, the kind that does not invite delay. You already know. The room seemed to shrink around that sentence, not physically, but in the way silence closes in when there is nowhere left for the truth to hide. I stood where I was, not stepping in, not interrupting, because this moment did not belong to me in the way it once might have. This was something David had to see for himself, without my guidance, without my protection. Victoria drew in a breath, her shoulders rising slightly before she let it out, and for the first time, her composure did not return with it. It was not all at once, she said, and there was a shift in her tone now, less polished, more exposed. There were expenses, investments, things that needed to be managed. I did not think it would matter as long as everything was taken care of. Taken care of. The phrase echoed faintly, hollow now, stripped of the reassurance it once carried. David's expression did not change quickly, but it changed completely. The trust that had once been there did not crack. It simply disappeared, replaced by something clearer, sharper, something that did not look for excuses. You used money that was meant for my mother, he said, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a statement that required no confirmation. Victoria opened her mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to soften what had already been said, but there was no version of this that could be reshaped into something acceptable. I watched her then, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that surprised even me. This was who she had always been. The difference was not in her actions, but in my awareness of them. David lowered his phone slowly, his hand steady, but the weight of what he had learned was visible in the way he held himself, in the way he no longer stood beside her, but apart from her, even in the same space. I need you to explain everything, he said, his voice even, but final, as if the path forward had already been chosen. And in that moment, as the last layer of illusion fell away, I realized something that felt both heavy and strangely freeing. The truth had done what it always does when given enough time. It had surfaced, not through confrontation or force, but through the quiet accumulation of facts that could no longer be ignored. And once it is seen clearly, it changes not just what you know, but who you trust and what
you are willing to accept from that moment on.
Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and in that silence, something in her finally gave way, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet shift, like a carefully balanced structure that had lost its center, without warning. She lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, but this time there was no attempt to soften her expression, no effort to maintain the version of herself she had presented for so long. It was temporary, she said, her voice quieter now, less controlled, as if the words were no longer being selected with the same precision. At first, it was just to cover some short-term gaps. I intended to replace everything before anyone noticed. Intended. The word lingered, carrying with it a kind of hollow assurance that no longer held any weight. David did not respond immediately, and I could see the way his thoughts were moving, not quickly, but deeply, connecting this explanation to everything he had already uncovered, everything that had not added up before. For 2 years, he said finally, his tone measured, almost detached, as if he was stepping outside of the situation just to understand it more clearly. You intended to replace it for 2 years. Victoria's lips pressed together slightly, and for the first time, there was no immediate answer ready, no carefully shaped explanation to bridge the gap between intention and reality. I stood quietly, watching the exchange unfold, but something inside me had already settled into place. The confusion that had filled the earlier moments was gone, replaced by a calm that did not come from resolution, but from clarity. There is a difference between not knowing and knowing exactly where you stand. I did not think it would affect anything, she said after a moment, her voice softer now, almost defensive. Your mother was managing. She never said anything. I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift within myself at those words. Not anger, not even hurt, but a recognition of how easily silence can be mistaken for acceptance. I had believed I was being strong, independent, not wanting to burden anyone with my struggles. But in that silence, I had also made it easier for something like this to continue unnoticed. David turned toward me then, and the look in his eyes was different from anything I had seen before. Not just concern, but understanding, the kind that comes too late to prevent what has already happened, but not too late to change what comes next. Mom, he said, and his voice carried something heavier now, something grounded in truth rather than assumption. I met his gaze, steady and calm, because there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to soften. I am not fragile, I said quietly, and the words felt clear, certain. I simply chose to trust. The distinction mattered, even if it came later than it should have. Victoria shifted slightly, as if she wanted to speak again, to regain some control over the direction of the conversation, but the space for that had narrowed in a way that could not be reopened. The dynamic in the room had changed, not with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with something far more permanent. The truth had been acknowledged, not just in words, but in understanding. David straightened, his posture no longer uncertain, and when he looked back at Victoria, it was with a clarity that did not leave room for misinterpretation. We're going to fix this, he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a finality that signaled the end of something and the beginning of something else entirely. I did not respond. I did not need to, because as I stood there, in the same kitchen where this conversation had begun, I realized that I was no longer standing in the same place I had been just an hour before. Not physically, but in every way that truly mattered. The room did not return to what it had been before, not after everything had been said, because once something like that is uncovered, it does not simply settle back into silence. It changes the shape of everything around it. David moved slowly, deliberately, setting his phone down on the table as if placing something heavier than it looked, and for a moment, no one spoke. The sound of the clock on the wall seemed louder than before, each second marking a distance that had not existed earlier that day. Victoria stood near the counter, her posture no longer composed, no longer controlled, but not entirely undone either. There was something in her expression now that was closer to realization than denial, as if she was beginning to understand that whatever explanation she had prepared, whatever reasoning she had relied on, it was no longer enough to hold things together. I reached for the edge of the chair and sat down slowly, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to be steady, fully present in a moment that deserved clarity, not reaction. For 2 years, I had lived a life shaped by absence, by what I believed was simply the natural narrowing of circumstances, and now I could see that it had been something else entirely. Not an accident. Not a misunderstanding.
A choice.
David turned toward me again, and this time there was no confusion in his eyes, only a quiet determination that had replaced it. "You should have had everything," he said, his voice low, but certain, as if he was stating something that could no longer be questioned. I met his gaze, not with resentment, but with a calm that had taken its place, because anger would have belonged to an earlier version of me, one that did not yet understand what had been happening. "I have what I need," I replied, and I meant it, though not in the way he might have expected. What I had now was something I had been missing for a long time.
Clarity.
Victoria shifted slightly, her eyes moving between us, and for the first time, she did not try to interrupt, did not try to guide the conversation back into something more manageable. The space no longer allowed for that. "This will be corrected," David said, more firmly now, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty about what needed to happen next. It was not a promise meant to comfort. It was a decision. I nodded once, acknowledging the words, but not relying on them, because I understood something else now, something that went beyond money or property or what had been taken. Trust, once given, does not return to its original shape simply because the truth has been revealed. It changes. It becomes something else, something more careful, more aware. I looked at Victoria then, not with hostility, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet finality that surprised even me. "I hope it was worth it," I said softly, not as an accusation, but as a statement that required no answer. She did not respond. There was nothing she could say that would alter what had already been seen, already been understood. The evening moved forward after that, not in the way I had planned when I woke up that morning, but in a way that felt more honest than anything that had come before it. And as I sat there in the same room, with the same people, I realized that something had ended, quietly, without ceremony, but something else had begun in its place. Not revenge, not even justice, not yet, but awareness. And sometimes, that is where real change begins, not with a loud moment, but with a quiet one where you finally see everything clearly and choose, from that point on, to never look away again.